The export controls were supposed to buy 5 years. They bought maybe 2. That's not a guess. It's the rough timeline Washington's own technologists gave in 2022 when the Bureau of Industry and Security first cut China off from advanced GPUs. 5 years, they said, maybe more, before China could close the gap on cutting-edge AI silicon. By the end of 2026, Chinese-designed chips are expected to power roughly half of the AI compute deployed inside China, not smuggled in, not reverse-engineered in some shadow facility, built, sold, and installed domestically with paperwork. NVIDIA wasn't in the room for that. And it's worth sitting with that for a second because NVIDIA didn't just lose market share. It lost relevance to a market it spent 2 decades cultivating. This is the company that built the CUDA ecosystem, the software moat every AI lab in the world still runs on. The company whose H100s became the de facto currency of the AI boom. And in the one country buying more AI compute than anywhere outside the United States, it's now a guest who didn't get a seat. Here's what I think most coverage of this story gets backward. The narrative everywhere has been China caught up on chip making. That's true, partially. Huawei's Ascend 910B and SMIC's N+2 process have closed real ground. But that's not actually the headline. The headline is that China stopped trying to build a better H100. It started building AI infrastructure that doesn't need one. That's a different problem. And it's the one nobody in Washington seems to be modeling. I want to be precise about what 50% domestic actually means, because the number gets thrown around loosely. It comes from estimates circulating among Chinese semiconductor analysts and cited in industry trade publications tracking domestic AI accelerator shipments against total compute deployment. Huawei's Ascend line, Byron's BR100 series, Cambricon's chips, and the state-backed Big Fund, China's National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, pouring capital into all of them simultaneously, not picking a winner, funding 5 competitors and letting the market sort it out, the same playbook China ran with solar panels a decade ago. I'm not 100% certain the 50% figure holds precisely by December. Supply chain numbers in China are notoriously hard to verify independently, and Beijing has incentives to inflate them. But the direction is not in dispute. Even NVIDIA's own CFO, Colette Kress, has acknowledged on earnings calls that China revenue as a share of data center business has collapsed from what it once was and isn't coming back to prior levels. So here's where this is actually going. Not a story about who makes the best chip. A story about what happens when the world's second largest economy decides it would rather build something worse, faster, than wait for permission to buy something better. There's a number I haven't told you yet, the actual performance gap between Ascend chips and NVIDIA's current generation. It matters more than the 50% figure does. We'll get to it. The performance gap is real, and it's bigger than Beijing wants you to know. Estimates from semiconductor analysts tracking Huawei's Ascend 910B put it somewhere between 1 and 2 full generations behind NVIDIA's top-tier chips on raw training throughput. On paper, that should matter enormously. In practice, it's mattering less every quarter, and the reason why is the part nobody's explaining well. Training a frontier model from scratch needs the best chip you can get, running inference, actually serving a chatbot's answers, generating images, processing a recommendation feed, needs something else entirely. It needs enough chip, cheaply, at scale, with predictable supply. And inference, not training, is where the overwhelming majority of real-world AI compute actually gets spent once a model is deployed. China figured this out early, possibly because it had no other choice. If you can't buy the best training silicon, you stop trying to win the training race and you start optimizing everything downstream of it. This is where DeepSeek matters, and not for the reason most people think. The DeepSeek story that made headlines in early 2025 wasn't really about a scrappy lab matching OpenAI on a shoestring budget, though that's the version that traveled. The real story, buried in the technical paper, was architectural. DeepSeek's engineers built a mixture of experts model that activated only a fraction of its total parameters per query, slashing the compute required per inference call. They didn't outbuild NVIDIA's hardware advantage. They made the hardware advantage matter less. That's the mechanism. China isn't closing the chip gap by building a better chip. It's closing it by needing a worse chip to do the job a better one used to require. Every Chinese AI lab building on top of architectures like this, and there are now several, including Alibaba's Quen team and Zhipu AI, is effectively lowering the bar that domestic silicon has to clear to be good enough. I keep coming back to one specific company in this story because it gets buried under the Huawei headlines: Biren Technology. Founded in 2019 by a former NVIDIA executive, Zhang Wen, Biren spent its first 3 years building GPUs aimed squarely at matching NVIDIA's A100. Then the October 2022 export controls hit, and Biren's chips, which depended on TSMC's advanced packaging, got caught in the blast radius before they'd even shipped at volume. The company nearly collapsed. By 2024, it had pivoted. Smaller chips, domestic fabrication through SMIC despite the yield penalties, narrower workloads. Biren didn't survive by getting back to the frontier. It survived by redefining what frontier meant for its customers. That's the pattern across the entire domestic stack, not triumph. Adaptation, repeated enough times that it starts to look like strategy. Remember the 5-year estimate from the opening? Here's where it actually lands. The export controls didn't fail because China broke the technology barrier. They're failing, partially, because the controls assumed China needed to clear the same bar NVIDIA set. China just moved the bar. There's a complication coming, though, and it's not the one Washington thinks it is. Here's the complication, and it's uncomfortable for the China has cracked it narrative as much as it is for the export control crowd. Domestic chips are still expensive to make, and the yields are still bad. SMIC's N+2 process, the workhorse behind most of China's advanced domestic silicon, runs without EUV lithography because ASML's EUV machines remain blocked from export under Dutch and US coordination. SMIC compensates with multi-patterning, essentially running a wafer through the older, deep ultraviolet lithography process multiple times to approximate what one EUV pass would achieve. It works. It also costs more, takes longer, and produces lower yields. Industry estimates have put SMIC's advanced node yields meaningfully below TSMC's comparable processes, though exact figures are closely guarded and vary by source. Every Ascend chip that ships is more expensive to produce than its performance would suggest, and that cost gets absorbed somewhere by the state, by Huawei's margins, or eventually by customers. So, the 50% domestic figure isn't really a story about China winning a technology race. It's a story about China being willing to pay a premium indefinitely for supply chain independence. That's a different kind of victory, and a more fragile one. It depends on continued state subsidy through vehicles like the Big Fund, on domestic AI labs accepting hardware that costs more and delivers less, and on Beijing's tolerance for inefficiency in service of strategic autonomy, holding steady through multiple budget cycles. I want to give the strongest version of the counterargument here, because it deserves real weight. The case against everything I've just laid out goes like this. Architectural efficiency gains like DeepSeek's mixture of experts approach aren't exclusive to China. American labs can adopt the same techniques, and they have fast. If US companies combine those efficiency gains with hardware that's still a full generation ahead, the compute gap doesn't close. It widens, just at a slower visible rate, because both sides get more efficient simultaneously and NVIDIA still sits on the better silicon underneath. That argument is not wrong. It might even be the more likely outcome over a 5-year horizon, but it misses something the 1-year horizon makes obvious: market access. Even if NVIDIA's chips remain superior indefinitely, superior but unavailable doesn't help a Chinese AI lab building a product today. A Chinese company optimizing for what it can actually deploy isn't choosing inferior technology out of national pride. It's choosing the only technology it's legally permitted to buy. And once an entire generation of Chinese engineers builds their tooling, their software stack, their institutional habits around Ascend and Byron architectures rather than CUDA, that's not a gap that closes the moment sanctions lift, if they ever do. It's a switching cost. Software ecosystems are sticky in exactly the way NVIDIA's own CUDA moat has proven for 15 years, and China just spent 4 years involuntarily building its own version of that stickiness, aimed inward. That's the reversal worth sitting with. The export controls were designed to deny China a chip. What they may have actually done is deny NVIDIA a generation of customers, permanently, regardless of what happens to the hardware gap from here. Jensen Huang has said publicly on multiple earnings calls that he believes China's AI market will eventually return to NVIDIA. I don't think the chips are the obstacle anymore. I think the habits are. So let's bring this together, because there are two separate questions that keep getting collapsed into one, and they have different answers. Question 1. Can China build a chip as good as NVIDIA's best? Not yet. Probably not by the end of 2026, and depending on how export controls evolve around EUV and advanced packaging, maybe not for years after that. SMIC's yield problems are real. The performance gap on raw training throughput is real. Anyone telling you China has caught up in the way that phrase usually implies is overselling the story. Question 2. Does China need to build a chip as good as NVIDIA's best? Increasingly, no. And that's the question that actually determines who controls the next decade of AI infrastructure inside the world's second-largest economy. Half of China's AI compute running on domestic silicon by the end of this year isn't a triumph of engineering parity. It's a triumph of redefined sufficiency, an entire industry deciding, out of necessity first and strategy second, that good enough, available, and ours beats better, but permission required. Here's my honest read on where this goes. I think the 50% figure becomes 65, maybe 70% by 2028. Not because the hardware gap closes dramatically, but because the switching costs I described compound. Every model trained on Ascend infrastructure, every engineer who learns Huawei's software stack instead of CUDA, every Chinese startup that builds its product assuming domestic chips from day one, that's not reversible the way a tariff is reversible. NVIDIA isn't losing a sale. It's losing the muscle memory of an entire generation of Chinese AI engineers, and muscle memory doesn't come back when the policy changes. What I keep returning to is the asymmetry nobody designed for. The export controls assumed China would either match the technology or stay behind. Nobody modeled the third option, that China would simply change what behind meant by shrinking the distance between good enough and best available until the difference stopped being decisive. That's not a loophole. That's a different theory of competition entirely, and it's one the original sanctions architecture never accounted for. For NVIDIA, and for the broader U.S. semiconductor strategy, the lesson here isn't that export controls don't work. It's that they work on a timeline, and the cost of that timeline is a market that learns to live without you. Once it learns that, getting invited back isn't really an option. The market just doesn't pull out the chair anymore. I don't think NVIDIA gets that China market back. Not fully. Not even after the politics shift. Some doors, once a country builds a workaround through them, just stay built around. That's where I'll leave it. If you think I've got the timeline wrong, or the 5-year estimate wrong, I genuinely want to hear the case for it in the comments.